April 14, 2026, 6:23 a.m. A pair of Russian Su-34 strike aircraft cross into Ukrainian airspace over occupied Zaporizhzhia at low altitude, loaded with KB-1500 glide bombs headed for Ukrainian defensive positions near Orikhiv. The crews are relaxed, confident. They've flown this exact corridor 3 times in the last 8 days and come home clean every time. The Ukrainian Air Defense Network, they figure, can't touch them at this altitude and speed. They're wrong. 19 seconds. That's all it takes. From the moment the first AIM-9X Sidewinder leaves its rail, to the moment the second Su-34 begins its terminal descent toward occupied farmland. 14 kilometers east, the engagement is over in 19 seconds. 2 Russian aircraft, 2 kills, 0 radar emissions from the Ukrainian side. The Russian crews never got a threat warning. They never had time to react, maneuver, or call for help. This is the story of a silent ambush, a tactic built over weeks of patient intelligence work, executed by 2 Ukrainian F-16 pilots flying in near-complete electromagnetic silence over contested airspace, and now studied by every aviation unit in the Ukrainian Air Force. This is the engagement Russian Aerospace Command still hasn't fully explained. The one that proved Ukraine doesn't just fight with Western weapons, but finds ways to use them that Western doctrine never imagined. I'm your host at Steel Front, where we break down the battles that change wars. This one changed the air war over southern Ukraine in ways that are still playing out today. To understand what happened over Zaporizhzhia on the morning of April 14th, 2026, you need to understand what the Russian Air Force had been doing along the southern axis for the 3 months before. And you need to understand how Ukrainian Air Force intelligence turned Russian operational discipline, a quality their forces rarely demonstrate, against them. Let's go back to the beginning. The winter of 2025 on 26 was brutal on the southern front. Russian forces spent the fall grinding at Ukrainian defensive positions near Orikhiv, a town sitting at a critical junction between Russian-occupied territory and Ukrainian-held ground in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. The town had been contested for months, but the defensive network around it, hardened trenches, artillery positions, pre-sighted engagement zones, had held. Russian ground commanders were frustrated. Their infantry advances ran into precise Ukrainian artillery and drone interdiction that made daylight movement across open ground suicidal. So Russian command made a decision that was, in isolation, tactically reasonable. They'd use their aviation assets to strike Ukrainian defensive infrastructure directly, not to support a ground advance in real time, but to degrade the positions making Ukrainian defense so effective. The Su-34, Russia's primary multi-role strike aircraft, was the weapon of choice. Armed with KB-1500S glide bombs, satellite-guided munitions with standoff range sufficient to release well outside Ukrainian short-range air defense coverage, the Su-34 offered a capability that Russian command believed was relatively safe to employ in the air defense environment over southern Ukraine. The problem with Russian tactical reasoning is almost always the same. They optimize for what works in the first few iterations, and they don't change when conditions shift. Here's what's most surprising about this engagement. It wasn't Ukrainian innovation that created opportunity. It was Russian predictability. The pattern Ukrainian Air Force intelligence identified wasn't subtle. It wasn't buried in encrypted traffic or revealed through a complex SIGINT operation. It was simply the product of Russian air crews flying the same corridor, at the same altitude, during the same morning time window, 3 times in 8 days. The Ukrainian intelligence analysts who first flagged this pattern were not senior officers. They were mid-grade specialists working in a fusion cell, combining radar data, drone observation, and OSINT tracking of Russian airfield activity at Berdyansk. 3 sorties, same ingress azimuth, same altitude, roughly 100 to 150 meters above ground level, low enough to stay under the detection horizon of Ukrainian ground-based radar for most of the approach. Same time window, between 6 a.m. and 6:45 a.m., exploiting the low-angle morning sun that complicates optical tracking systems. Which weapon was deadlier in this engagement? The AIM-9X Sidewinder that made the kill, the ground-based radar network that cued the intercept without compromising the F-16s, or the intelligence analysis that identified the pattern in the first place? Comment below, because the answer shapes how you think about modern air warfare. The fusion cell flagged the pattern on April 6, 2026, after the third observed sortie. Their report moved up the intelligence chain to Ukrainian Air Force Command with a recommendation that reads, in summary, if the pattern holds for a fourth sortie within the same operational period, the corridor represents a viable intercept opportunity, provided a Ukrainian intercept force can approach from a geometry that avoids Russian radar coverage and can achieve targeting lock using passive means only. The reasoning for the passive-only requirement was critical, and it explains everything that follows. The Su-34 is not a defenseless aircraft. It carries the L-175V Cabini electronic countermeasures pod, which detects radar emissions from opposing aircraft and warns the crew. If the Ukrainian F-16s had activated their own onboard radar, the AN/APG-83 AESA radar installed in the Block 70 F-16s Ukraine received through the Combined International Transfer Program in late 2024, there was a real chance the Cabini system would have detected the radar energy and warned the Russian crews. Even a few seconds of warning would have given the Su-34 crews time to brake, accelerate, and potentially escape the engagement envelope. So Ukrainian mission planners faced a hard problem. How do you achieve weapons quality targeting on a fast-moving aircraft at close range without using your own radar? The answer was already in the weapons system. The AIM-9X Block 2 Sidewinder is an imaging infrared seeker sussel. It tracks heat. More precisely, it tracks the infrared signature of a target aircraft's engines, using a focal plane array seeker that can lock onto a target at ranges up to roughly 22 kilometers under optimal conditions and can hold lock through aggressive maneuvering. The AIM-9X doesn't require continuous radar illumination from the launching aircraft. It requires only that the launching aircraft get close enough and achieve the right geometry for the seeker to pick up the target's heat, signature, and go autonomous. Stay with me, because what happens next is where this engagement becomes extraordinary and where two Russian Su-34 crews fly into a situation they have absolutely no way to recognize until it's far too late. The complication arrived on April 9, 2026, 5 days before the intercept. A planned pre-positioning movement of the two F-16s designated for the mission to their forward operating location had to be scrubbed when Russian drone activity in the transit corridor spiked unexpectedly. Ukrainian Air Force Command assessed that proceeding under those conditions created an unacceptable risk of revealing the forward basing arrangement, which would have killed the element of surprise the entire plan depended on. The F-16 stayed at their primary base. The window for the intercept, if the Russians held to their pattern, was closing. Mission planners ran the numbers. If a fourth sortie didn't materialize by April 16th, the operational period would likely close, and the Russians might change their procedures. 4 days. 4 days to complete the pre-positioning under revised routing that avoided the flagged drone coverage zones, finalize the intercept geometry, brief the pilots, coordinate with the ground radar network providing the passive cue, and get into position. The mission planning team worked through the nights of April 10th and 11th. The aircraft movement was completed in darkness on April 12th, with the 16s transiting at low altitude through a pre-cleared corridor to their forward operating location, a dispersed site that I won't identify beyond saying it was close enough to the projected intercept point to allow a rapid climb and intercept before the Su-34s completed their bomb run. I spent time reviewing the open source reconstruction of this engagement, the tracking data, the timing, the geometry, and one detail kept coming back to me. The forward operating location used for this intercept was almost certainly not purpose-built for this mission. Ukrainian aviation has been developing a network of dispersed, survivable basing options ever since the first Russian Kinzhal strikes targeted Ukrainian airfields in early 2024. The ability to generate a combat sortie from a location Russian intelligence hadn't mapped as an active aviation site was not an accident or an improvisation. It was infrastructure, quiet, patient, expensive infrastructure built over months that made this specific tactic possible. Ukrainian Air Force Command briefed the two pilots on April 12th and 13th. The mission profile was unorthodox enough that the briefing reportedly took several hours. The key constraint was absolute. No radar emissions from either F-16 at any point during the mission, not for navigation, not for situational awareness, not for weapons employment. The pilots would rely on data-linked information from the ground radar network, which would track the Su-34s and transmit targeting geometry to the F-16s via the Link 16 data network, a NATO standard tactical data link that allows ground stations to feed real-time target tracks to aircraft without requiring the aircraft to use their own sensors. The F-16s would know exactly where the Russian aircraft were. The Russian aircraft would have no idea the F-16s existed. How many aircraft across all Russian combat aviation sorties along the Zaporizhzhia axis during the February through April 2026 period were Su-34? Strike platforms? Was it approximately 23 total sorties, 38, or closer to 50? We'll give you the answer at the end of this video. Hold that question. The intercept geometry was the most technically demanding part of the plan. The F-16s needed to approach the Su-34 pair from a direction and altitude that kept them below Russian radar coverage throughout the approach, then execute a rapid climb to close within AIM-9X employment distance before the Russian crews could react. Ukrainian mission planners identified the optimal intercept point roughly 45 kilometers northeast of Melitopol, where the Su-34 ingress corridor crossed terrain feature that briefly masked the Ukrainian aircraft from Russian ground-level radar systems in the area. The geometry required the F-16s to hold at approximately 80 meters above ground level during the approach, not a comfortable altitude in contested airspace, particularly in low visibility morning conditions. The pilots flew that profile in simulation, then in a rehearsal sortie over Ukrainian-controlled territory on April 13th. They walked through the radar geometry on digital displays during the full mission briefing review, checking timing windows against the projected Su-34 route. The question the lead pilot reportedly asked at the end of the briefing was simple. What happens if the Russians are 5 minutes early? The answer was equally simple. If the Su-34s arrived early, the intercept geometry would fail. The F-16s wouldn't be in position, the mission would be scrubbed, and the aircraft would egress without engaging. Subscribe to Steel Front if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because this level of planning, this discipline, this precision in execution is what separates a successful ambush from a disaster. What comes next on April 14th is a masterclass in execution under pressure. April 13th, 2026. Late evening, Ukrainian intelligence analysts are reviewing the latest data from Berdyansk airfield, where Russian Su-34 activity has been monitored continuously for the past week. Satellite imagery confirmed 2 Su-34 aircraft undergoing pre-flight servicing in the evening hours, consistent with preparation for an early morning sortie. Intercepted communications from Russian ground control elements near Melitopol indicated coordination for a strike package delivery in the early morning window. The pattern was holding. The fourth sortie appeared imminent. Ukrainian Air Force Command issued the execute order at 11:45 p.m. on April 13th. The two F-16 pilots at the forward operating location began their pre-flight sequence. The ground radar coordination package, the network of stations that would track the Russian aircraft and feed targeting data to the F-16s, was activated and verified. The Link 16 data network was tested. The AIM-9X missiles on each aircraft were checked. The pilots reviewed the intercept geometry one final time. At 3:17 a.m. on April 14th, both F-16s were airborne, transiting at low altitude toward their holding position near the pre-designated intercept point. No radar, navigation by GPS and data-linked position from the ground network. The night was cold and partially overcast, ceiling approximately 2,400 meters, with intermittent ground fog in low-lying areas that actually helped the Ukrainian pilots by obscuring their thermal signatures from any Russian optical surveillance that might have been active. The holding position was approximately 38 kilometers from the projected intercept point. The F-16s arrived at 4:52 a.m. and entered a racetrack holding pattern at 80 meters altitude, minimum radar reflective profile, engines at cruise power, completely silent electronically. And then they waited. Put yourself in those cockpits for a moment, 80 meters above the ground, in darkness, no radar, no ability to actively search the airspace around you. Your only picture of the tactical situation comes from the data link feed showing ground, derived tracks of everything the radar network can see, which doesn't include anything flying as low as you are, because you're below the radar horizon yourself. You are flying on trust. Trust in the intelligence analysts who identified the pattern. Trust in the ground radar operators tracking the Russian aircraft. Trust in the weapon system that will need to acquire and lock a target at close range in a matter of seconds when the moment comes. This is what courage looks like in modern air warfare, not the cinematic vision of dogfights and afterburner climbs. Precision discipline. 2 pilots in the dark, waiting. At 6:04 a.m., the ground radar 8 network detected the departure of 2 aircraft from Russian-controlled airspace near Berdyansk, flying northwest at low altitude and high speed. The profile matched the previous Su-34 sorties exactly. The Link 16 feed updated in the F-16 cockpits. 2 contacts range approximately 87 kilometers, altitude 140 meters above ground level, speed 900 kilometers per hour. ETA to the projected intercept waypoint, approximately 17 minutes. At 6:09 a.m., Ukrainian Air Force Command issued the final execute confirmation. The ground radar network confirmed the Russian aircraft's azimuth and timing were within acceptable parameters. The intercept was on. Here's what strikes us at Steel Front about this moment. The decision to proceed was not made by the pilots. It was made by a command structure that had spent 2 weeks building the conditions for this engagement. The pilot's job was execution. The command element's job was to give them the clearest possible decision space and then stay out of the way. That division of responsibility, that trust in the people closest to the fight, is something Russian Aviation Command structurally cannot replicate, and it shows in outcomes like this one. At 6:17 a.m., the ground radar network reported the Russian aircraft passing a designated waypoint indicating they were committed to the ingress corridor and approximately 9 minutes from their projected weapons release point. The F-16 lead pilot received the update on data link and executed the pre-planned sequence. Increase altitude to 300 meters. Begin acceleration toward the intercept geometry point, maintain electromagnetic silence. At 6:19 a.m., both F-16s were accelerating. Still no radar. Still completely passive. The Russian Su-34 crews, flying at 140-meter altitude and 900 kilometers per hour toward their target area, had no awareness of the intercept force. Their RWR systems were clean, no threat emitters, no radar log. The mission was proceeding exactly as it had on the previous 3 sorties. The central question aviation analysts have been debating since the details emerged is the moment of IR seeker acquisition. The AIM-9X's infrared seeker is extraordinarily sensitive, capable of detecting the heat signature of a modern turbofan engine at extended ranges. But geometry matters enormously. The seeker works best from the rear hemisphere, where engine exhaust produces the strongest infrared signature. A head-on or beam approach presents a much weaker IR signature and can make seeker acquisition harder, particularly at extended range. Ukrainian mission planners had accounted for this. The intercept geometry was designed to place the F-16s in position to make their rapid climb and closing approach from a rear quarter aspect, approaching the Su-34 pair from behind and slightly to the side, maximizing the IR signature the AIM-9X seekers would be working with. This required precise timing. Climb too early, and the F-16s would appear on Russian radar before reaching firing range. Climb too late, and the geometry would be wrong, a head-on closure with inadequate IR acquisition time. At 6:21 a.m., the ground radar network confirmed the Su-34 pair had passed the critical waypoint. Range to the F-16 holding position, approximately 31 kilometers. Accounting for the Su-34's inbound speed and the F-16's acceleration, the intercept geometry would reach optimal parameters in approximately 90 seconds. At 6:21 a.m. and approximately 35 seconds, the lead F-16 pilot executed the planned climb. Both aircraft went to full military power, not afterburner, which would have generated a large heat signature visible to any passive IR search system, and pulled upward from 300 meters to approximately 1,200 meters altitude in a zoom climb, trading airspeed for altitude and approach geometry. The data link feed was now showing both Russian aircraft clearly, range decreasing rapidly. At 6:22 a.m. and 10 seconds, the lead pilot's AIM-9X seeker growled in his headset. In the F-16's helmet-mounted cueing system, the seeker's field of view centered on the lead Su-34's engine exhaust signature. Acquisition confirmed. The seeker was locked. The wingman's AIM-9X acquired the second Su-34 approximately 4 seconds later. Range at first acquisition, approximately 11 kilometers. Well within the AIM-9X's employment envelope, the Russian crews still had no indication of the threat. At 6:22 a.m. and 28 seconds, the lead pilot fired. The AIM-9X left the rail, motor igniting, seeker locked on the lead Su-34's engine heat. At 6:22 a.m. and 31 seconds, the wingman fired. 19 seconds after the first missile left the rail, both Russian aircraft had been struck. The AIM-9X is a within visual range missile, but it doesn't require the launching pilot to see the target with their own eyes. The helmet-mounted cueing system allows the pilot to cue the seeker using data link, provided targeting information, and then confirm acquisition through the seeker audio tone. The entire engagement was within visual range by the technical definition of the geometry, approximately 8 to 11 kilometers, but neither Ukrainian pilot had visual confirmation of the Russian aircraft against the low-angle morning sun and scattered ground haze. They were firing on seeker tone and data link confirmation. That matters. It demonstrates a level of crew training and procedural confidence that represents a genuine qualitative leap in Ukrainian Air Force capability. A year earlier, Ukrainian pilots trained primarily on Soviet-era aircraft and weapons would have been unlikely to execute this kind of engagement. The transition to F-16s, combined with the training pipeline that multiple NATO member states contributed to over 2024 and 2025, reportedly totaling over 4,000 hours of advanced tactics instruction across the Ukrainian F-16 pilot cohort, is showing results in exactly this kind of demanding, non-standard scenario. The lead Su-34 was struck by the first AIM-9X in the right engine section. Combat footage analysis, reviewed by open-source analysts using multiple camera angles from Ukrainian observation drones operating in the area, positioned to document the engagement if it succeeded, shows the aircraft entering a rapid roll to the right immediately after impact, consistent with catastrophic loss of right engine thrust and possible control system damage. The crew ejected approximately 6 seconds after impact. Both ejection seats fired successfully. The aircraft impacted occupied territory, approximately 3 kilometers from the ejection point. If you've ever watched a combat ejection sequence, the violence of it, the disorientation, imagine executing that at 140 meters altitude and 850 kilometers per hour after what felt like a clear, uneventful morning. That's what those Russian crews experienced. The second Su-34, the wingman, was struck approximately 7 seconds after the first. The AIM-9X impacted the aircraft's left engine, and likely the fuel system, because the resulting fireball was significantly larger than a pure engine strike would produce. Combat footage shows the aircraft entering an immediate uncontrolled descent with significant structural fire. It impacted farmland approximately 14 kilometers east of the intercept point. No ejection was observed. Ukrainian sources assessed the crew did not survive. By 6:23 a.m., approximately 90 seconds after the F-16s had initiated their climb from holding altitude, both Su-34s were destroyed. Both F-16s were egressing south at low altitude, still with no radar emissions active. They had not been illuminated by any Russian radar system during the engagement. They had not used their own radar. The entire intercept had been conducted using passive infrared targeting, cued by ground-based radar data link. Russian ground control in the area registered the loss of communication with both Su-34 aircraft at 6:24 a.m. Initial assessment, according to what Ukrainian intelligence later assessed from intercepted communications, was a possible mid-air collision between the two Russian aircraft. Because there was no radar warning data, no radio call from the crews indicating a threat, no emission from an attacking aircraft that could be used to reconstruct what had happened. The Su-34 crews, to the last moment they were likely conscious, did not know they were under attack. Here's a take that some will push back on, and we'll say it plainly. The Russian Air Force's failure to detect and respond to the pattern exploitation that created this ambush is not primarily a technology failure. It's a command culture failure. A Western Air Force operating the same equipment would have varied its ingress corridors, timing windows and altitude profiles as a matter of basic operational security after the first or second sortie. Russian air crews and their command element repeated an identical pattern 4 times because Russian aviation command culture does not consistently empower the people closest to the risk, the air crews themselves, to deviate from assigned procedures without explicit authorization from above. The corridor was assigned by a staff officer. The air crews flew it. Nobody in that chain had the authority, or apparently the inclination, to ask whether flying the same route at the same time every 2 days was creating a vulnerability. That institutional rigidity has a body count. It's had a body count throughout this war. It will continue to until Russian Aviation Command fundamentally changes how it operates, which doesn't happen quickly in a military culture as hierarchical as Russia's. But the story doesn't end with the tactical execution. The immediate aftermath created a problem Ukrainian command hadn't fully anticipated. The ejected crew from the first Su-34 came down over occupied territory. That's expected. What wasn't expected was that Russian search and rescue coordination, which Ukrainian signals intelligence was monitoring, revealed that the Russian ground search teams were confused about where to look because the aircraft had impacted nearly 3 kilometers from the ejection point, and the search teams had initially gone to the wrong location. That window of confusion gave Ukrainian special operations personnel operating in the area information about Russian response force positioning that was separately valuable. It was not part of the original mission plan. It was a consequence of the engagement that Ukrainian intelligence was able to exploit. This is the compounding effect of operational success. Each successful operation generates information and opportunities that weren't fully anticipated in the planning phase. Ukrainian command has gotten increasingly skilled at exploiting second-order effects in ways that Russian command consistently fails to. At 7:15 a.m., the 2 F-16s landed at their forward operating location. Total mission duration from takeoff to landing, approximately 2 hours and 58 minutes. The pilots were debriefed immediately. Ukrainian Air Force intelligence and mission analysis personnel were already reconstructing the engagement from the available data. Ground radar tracks, drone footage, signals intelligence, the pilot's own recollections. By 9:30 a.m. on April 14, 2026, the engagement debrief was complete, before Russian forces had finished searching for the crews of the aircraft they'd lost. That's not just operational efficiency. It's an entire institutional culture working together. Intelligence analysts, mission planners, air defense coordinators, pilots, special operations personnel, all oriented toward the same purpose, making the next engagement more effective than this one. One detail stayed with me when reviewing the reconstruction of this engagement. At no point during the entire mission, from the F-16's departure from the forward operating location to their return, did either aircraft's radar emit a single pulse. The electromagnetic silence discipline was total. In an environment where electronic warfare and emissions detection are ubiquitous on the modern battlefield, that level of discipline in a high-pressure combat engagement is genuinely remarkable. Ukrainian pilots had been trained for this. They executed it perfectly. Ukrainian General Staff reports in the days following the engagement confirmed the loss of 2 Russian Su-34 aircraft in the Zaporizhzhia area without providing operational details. Russian military bloggers attributed the losses to a possible medium-range missile strike from Ukrainian ground forces, which tells you exactly what the Russian information picture looked like from their side. They didn't know what had happened. They were guessing. And they were wrong. The broader assessment of the engagement's strategic impact requires some context about the Su-34's role in Russian air operations at the time. By April 2026, Russia's Su-34 fleet had suffered meaningful attrition since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. The aircraft had proven effective in the glide bomb delivery role, but vulnerable to Ukrainian air defense when operating at medium and high altitudes, which had driven the development of the low-altitude ingress tactic this mission exploited. Russian Aviation Command had invested significantly in developing that low-altitude tactic as a survivability measure. The silent ambush demonstrated that the tactic, while effective against ground-based radar coverage, was vulnerable to exactly the kind of passive-only air-to-air intercept that Ukrainian mission planners had developed. If you believe tactics win wars, not just weapons, not just numbers, but the ability to identify and exploit an opponent's doctrinal rigidity, type Steelfront in the comments. Because what happened over Zaporizhzhia on April 14th is a case study in exactly that. In the week following the engagement, Ukrainian Air Force analysts prepared a detailed lessons learned document, later described by Western Liaison officers as one of the most thorough tactical analysis products they had seen from any military in recent years. The document analyzed not just the execution of the silent ambush, but the conditions that made it possible. The intelligence fusion that identified the pattern, the ground radar network architecture that enabled passive cueing, the pre-positioning infrastructure that allowed rapid generation of a combat sortie from an unexpected location, and the training pipeline that had produced pilots capable of executing a non-standard engagement profile under pressure. The document was shared in sanitized form with Ukrainian Air Force squadron commanders. It became the basis for what Ukrainian aviation circles are now calling the passive intercept framework, a doctrine for exploiting predictable Russian ingress corridors using radar-silent F-16 operations cued by ground-based networks. The framework has since been applied in at least 2 additional engagements along the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson axes, with results that Ukrainian command has not fully publicized, but that Russian aviation activity data suggests were similarly effective. A measurable reduction in Russian Su-34 sorties along the specific corridors where the framework was applied, beginning in late April 2026. Russian Aviation Command, faced with unexplained losses in what had been assessed as survivable ingress corridors, did eventually begin varying their timing and routing. But the adaptation has been slow and inconsistent. Exactly what you'd expect from a command culture that prioritizes top-down procedure over frontline initiative. By the time this script was developed, Ukrainian intelligence analysts had identified at least 2 new recurring patterns in Russian strike aviation behavior along the southern axis. The game continues. What would NATO have done differently with the same intelligence picture and the same assets? It's a genuinely interesting question, and the answers aren't obvious. Comment your analysis below. The doctrinal comparison between Ukrainian adaptive tactics and NATO standard procedures is one of the more fascinating analytical threads to emerge from this war. There's a broader lesson embedded in the silent ambush that goes beyond the specific technical details of how 2 F-16s destroyed 2 Su-34s without using their own radar. It's a lesson about the relationship between intelligence and operations. A relationship the Ukrainian military has developed into one of its genuine competitive advantages over the course of this conflict. Most militaries treat intelligence and operations as sequential. Gather intelligence, then decide, then execute. Ukrainian Air Force planning on the silent ambush treated them as simultaneous and iterative. Gather intelligence while planning, adjust the plan as intelligence evolves, build the execution around what the intelligence says is possible, then use the execution itself to generate new intelligence for follow-on operations. The result is a cycle that moves faster than an adversary still running the sequential model. And speed, in modern warfare, is often the decisive factor. The ground radar network that enabled the passive queuing for the intercept is itself a product of this philosophy. Ukrainian air defense coordinators recognized months before this engagement that the F-16's own radar was simultaneously its greatest strength and its most significant vulnerability in contested airspace, because using it announced the aircraft's presence to any radar warning receiver within range. Building a ground-based queuing capability that allowed the F-16 to operate as a purely passive system was not a response to a specific threat. It was a proactive investment in a capability that might become useful. It became useful on April 14. The AIM-9X Sidewinder's role in this engagement deserves some additional technical detail, because it represents a weapons employment concept not commonly discussed in open-source analysis of the Ukrainian air war. The AIM-9X Block 2 variant, the configuration used by Ukrainian F-16s, incorporates a thrust vectoring motor that gives it an off-bore sight, engagement capability far exceeding earlier Sidewinder variants. The missile can engage targets at angles of up to 90 degrees off the aircraft nose, dramatically expanding the engagement envelope compared to earlier infrared missiles that required the launching aircraft to be pointed almost directly at the target. The Ukrainian pilots didn't need to point their aircraft directly at the Russian Su-34s to achieve seeker lock. They needed only to position the F-16s such that the helmet-mounted sight could cue the seeker into the general direction of the targets, and the seeker's own acquisition would handle the precise targeting. In the context of a low-altitude, high-speed intercept where pointing directly at the target would create a problematic geometry, this capability was critical. The pilots achieved seeker lock from a slightly offset approach angle that preserved their position relative to the Russian radar coverage picture, rather than driving them directly into the threat axis. Real tactics, real consequences, steel front. The Su-34 itself deserves some additional analysis, because understanding its capabilities and limitations helps explain why it was vulnerable to this kind of engagement. The Su-34 is a development of the Su-27 family, designed as a supersonic all-weather strike aircraft. It has a side-by-side cockpit arrangement unusual for combat aircraft, and can carry a substantial payload of precision and unguided munitions. Its maximum speed is approximately 1,900 kilometers per hour at altitude, with a combat radius of roughly 1,100 kilometers. In the glide bomb delivery role, it had become Russia's primary means of attacking Ukrainian defensive infrastructure at standoff range, using the KB series satellite-guided bombs that could be released at distances of up to 60 to 80 kilometers from the target, well outside the range of most Ukrainian short-range air defense systems. The low-altitude delivery tactic was designed to exploit the geometry of Ukrainian ground-based radar coverage, which has significant limitations against very low-flying aircraft due to terrain masking. What Russian aviation planners appear not to have fully accounted for was that this same low-altitude profile, flown along a predictable corridor, created a geometry exploitable by an air-to-air intercept force operating from a forward position with passive queuing. The very tactic designed to protect the Su-34 from Ukrainian ground-based threats created the vulnerability Ukrainian mission planners exploited. This is, at a fundamental level, what makes warfare an iterative intellectual contest, rather than a straightforward application of superior resources. Every tactic creates new vulnerabilities. Every solution generates new problems. The side that adapts faster wins. Not just individual engagements, but the overall contest of military effectiveness. Ukraine has demonstrated, repeatedly and across multiple domains throughout this conflict, an ability to adapt faster than its opponent. The silent ambush over Zaporizhzhia is one of the clearest examples yet. Ukrainian General Staff reporting confirmed that Russian Su-34 activity on the Zaporizhzhia corridor decreased by approximately 65 to 70%. The 2 weeks following the April 14th engagement, based on Ukrainian air defense, tracking data, and satellite imagery analysis of Berdyansk airfield. Operations. Russian strike aviation sorties on the southern axis did not cease, but they became less predictable in timing, more variable in routing, and more heavily coordinated with electronic warfare coverage that suggested Russian command understood, at some level, that something had changed in the Ukrainian air defense picture, even if they didn't know exactly what. The degradation of Russian glide bomb delivery on the Orikhiv axis had a tangible effect on the ground situation. Ukrainian defensive positions near Orikhiv that had been subjected to heavy KB series strikes in the preceding 2 months reported a significant reduction in air-delivered munitions impact in the weeks following the engagement. That gave Ukrainian engineers and defensive forces time to repair damage, reinforce positions, and pre-position supplies without the constant threat of air-delivered precision munitions. Ground commanders in that sector reported improved defensive effectiveness as a direct consequence of the reduced air threat. Pressure, 1 engagement, 19 seconds, 2 aircraft, and a measurable improvement in the ground tactical situation for Ukrainian forces in the Orikhiv area. That's what tactical excellence multiplied across a complex operational environment looks like. The pilots who flew this mission have not been publicly identified, consistent with Ukrainian security protocols for aviation personnel. What is known is that both are experienced aviators who completed the F-16 transition training program and had accumulated meaningful combat hours before April 14th. Their ability to execute a completely non-standard engagement profile, passive intercept, data link queuing, off-boresight AIM-9X employment, extended low-altitude holding in contested airspace, represents the highest level of tactical proficiency in what is still, by any measure, a young F-16 community. The Ukrainian Air Force received its first F-16s in a delivery that began in the late summer of 2024, after a lengthy political and logistical process involving multiple NATO member states. The Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, and Norway collectively committed to transfer Block 70 and upgraded Block 20 aircraft under a combined program, coordinated through a dedicated transfer authority. Training was conducted at multiple locations across Europe, with pilot training programs run by the United States Air Force at bases in the United States, supplemented by European partners. By late 2025, Ukraine had developed a small but growing cadre of genuinely experienced F-16 pilots. Not just pilots who could fly the aircraft, but pilots who could employ it tactically in the demanding high-threat environment of contested Ukrainian airspace. The silent ambush engagement is evidence that this investment has produced real operational capability. The training programs that Western partners funded and ran, programs that sometimes faced political criticism for their cost and timeline, delivered pilots who could execute an engagement that no one in those programs likely explicitly envisioned when the curriculum was being designed. That's what genuine capability development looks like. You train people to the highest standard, give them the best equipment, and then trust them to figure out applications that doctrine hasn't yet codified. There's a common assumption that air-to-air combat in the modern era is primarily a long-range, beyond visual range contest, an exchange of radar-guided missiles at distances where the pilots never see each other. This engagement challenges that assumption, not by demonstrating that within visual range combat is somehow superior, but by showing that the within visual range envelope, approached with the right weapon, and the right geometry, and the right electronic discipline, can be more survivable for the attacking force than the beyond visual range exchange both sides would normally prefer. In a beyond visual range engagement, both sides are emitting radar. Both sides know the other is there. In a within visual range engagement conducted on passive sensors only, one side knows everything and the other side knows nothing. Ukraine, on April 14, 2026, chose the silent option, and it worked perfectly. The engagement debrief reached a conclusion that has since become something of a guiding principle for the passive intercept framework. An aircraft that doesn't emit is an aircraft that doesn't exist, as far as the opponent's defensive picture is concerned. Electromagnetic silence, maintained with discipline, and enabled by a sufficiently capable passive sensor and a reliable data link network for external queuing, transforms the tactical situation from a symmetric contest into an asymmetric one. The Su-34 crews were not negligent or incompetent by the standards of their training and operational experience. They were following their procedures correctly. They simply had no defense against a threat they couldn't see, couldn't detect, and couldn't anticipate, because nothing in their training or operational experience had prepared them for an opponent willing and able to execute an air-to-air intercept in complete electromagnetic silence. There's something worth acknowledging here that doesn't often make it into tactical analysis of Ukrainian air operations. The ground radar network that enabled this engagement is itself a product of extraordinary collective effort. The operators who maintained and coordinated that network, who tracked the Russian aircraft precisely enough to provide weapons-quality targeting data to the F-16s without the pilots needing to use their own radar, performed a function that is arguably as critical to the engagement's success as anything the pilots did. These are not people who will be recognized in any public reporting. Their names will not be in the debrief. But the silent ambush over Zaporizhzhia doesn't happen without them. That's something about this war that consistently strikes us at steel front. The degree to which Ukrainian military effectiveness is genuinely collective, distributed across intelligence analysts, radar operators, drone crews, ground controllers, logistics personnel, and the pilots and soldiers who execute at the point of contact. Russian military effectiveness, by contrast, tends to be more concentrated in individual platforms and individual commanders, with the human connective tissue between those elements much weaker. The silent ambush is a collective achievement, and the Russian failure to detect and prevent it is a collective failure. By late April 2026, the lessons learned document from the April 14th engagement had been distributed across Ukrainian Air Force tactical aviation units. Training exercises based on the passive intercept framework were being run at Ukrainian training facilities. Ukrainian aviation instructors were working with Western liaison officers to refine the ground radar cueing procedures that had enabled the engagement to make them more robust, faster, and applicable across a wider range of engagement geometries. The air war over Ukraine is changing. Not because Ukraine has more aircraft than Russia, it doesn't. Not because Ukrainian aircraft are inherently superior to Russian aircraft. The performance characteristics of a Block 70 F-16 and a current production Su-35s are in the same general tier of combat capability. Ukraine is changing the air war because Ukrainian aviation planners are willing to think about weapons and sensors and networks in combinations that Russian doctrine hasn't considered, and because Ukrainian pilots are trained and trusted to execute those combinations under the most demanding conditions imaginable. That is the real lesson of April 14th, 2026. Not F-16 beats Su-34. The engagement geometry on this specific day meant the F-16s won comprehensively, but the aircraft type was almost secondary. The real story is that a well-trained, well-supported, creatively employed air intercept force, armed with capable passive sensors and a reliable external cueing network, can engage and destroy a threat that has no awareness of its own vulnerability. And if Ukraine can continue to develop and refine that capability, if the passive intercept framework becomes a mature, repeatable doctrine rather than a single brilliant improvisation, it will represent a genuine transformation of the air war over the southern axis. Team F-16 or Team Su-34 in the tactical analysis? That's the wrong question. Comment with your take on whether passive electromagnetic tactics will become the defining air-to-air doctrine of the 2020s. Because that's the question this engagement actually raises. Here is the answer to the quiz question from earlier in this video. We asked how many Su-34 sorties Russian aviation flew along the Zaporizhzhia axis during the February through April 2026 period. Based on open-source tracking data compiled from satellite imagery, Ukrainian air defense reporting, and OSINT analysis of Russian airfield activity at Berdyansk and Saki, the figure is approximately 38 documented Su-34 strike sorties on the southern axis during that period, the B option. The corridor that Ukrainian planners identified for the silent ambush was used in 4 of those sorties, making it one of the most consistently repeated ingress routes in the entire period. That consistency was the vulnerability. That vulnerability became the kill. And now the questions that matter for anyone serious about understanding modern air warfare. Was the decision to hold at low altitude and maintain electromagnetic silence throughout the entire approach the right tactical choice? Some analysts have argued that a brief radar emission at close range, just long enough to confirm target geometry before missile release, would have increased the probability of a clean kill. The Ukrainian planners disagreed, and the engagement validated their reasoning. But would you have made the same call, knowing that even a brief emission might have been enough to warn the Russian crews and compromise the entire operation? Could Russian Aviation Command have prevented this? The answer requires honesty about institutional limitations. The pattern that created the vulnerability was identifiable in sense. Any competent operational security review should have flagged this repetition of corridor, timing, and altitude. The fact that no such review evidently resulted in procedure changes suggests a systemic failure in how Russian Aviation Command processes operational security feedback. Could they have caught it? Probably yes. Did they? Demonstrably no. What would a different command culture have produced? And what would you have done differently as a Ukrainian mission planner with the same intelligence picture? Or as a Russian aviation commander, reviewing your squadron's sortie patterns in the week before April 14th? The answer to that question from both sides of the problem is the actual content of the doctrinal lessons this engagement will teach for years to come. Subscribe to Steel Front. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The engagements where intelligence meets creativity, where discipline enables audacity, and where 19 seconds of execution represent weeks of invisible preparation by hundreds of people working in coordination, real tactics, real consequences. Steel Front, the skies over Zaporizhzhia are still contested. The farmland where the second Su-34 impacted is occupied territory, unreachable by Ukrainian investigation teams. The wreckage sits in those fields, photographed by satellite, analyzed by imagery analysts on both sides. A silent marker of the morning when 2 Russian aircrews flew a familiar corridor for what they didn't know was the last time. Modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy and without warning. Stay vigilant.